Few Christians today linger over the ritual purity laws in the Pentateuch. This lack of familiarity with the Torah and with how the Torah was understood in ancient Judaism is often combined with a profound failure of historical imagination, and this leads to major misreadings of the New Testament. In this video, I want to propose a model that explains how the purity system functioned in the Old Testament context before the Second Temple period, and how it was understood in Rabbinic Judaism after the end of the Second Temple period. The model also accounts for much of the evidence in the Second Temple period itself, including the New Testament. But first, let's look at some common ways the idea of purity in the Second Temple period has been misunderstood. The first misunderstanding is a conflation between ritual impurity and sin, assuming that people thought it was sinful to be ritually impure and that sin made someone ritually impure. So on the slide, she was constantly ritually unclean, says Leonard Swidler, which made her in some sense displeasing to God. In Luke chapter 7, Simon the Pharisee watches a woman bathing Jesus' feet with her tears and thinks to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. It's easy to understand why a casual reader of this passage might assume that sinfulness and ritual impurity go together, that it was considered sinful to be ritually impure, and perhaps that the impurity caused by sin could be passed by physical contact. A connection between sin and impurity may seem obvious because Christians today tend to think of purity and impurity in exclusively moral terms. I'm guessing that for many Christians, the first thing that comes to mind when someone says purity or impurity is the presence or absence of impure sexual thoughts or sexual activity outside of marriage. Once you look at the purity laws in Leviticus 11 through 15 and Numbers chapter 19, problems with a connection between impurity and sin immediately arise. The purity issues these chapters address have to do with the ordinary stuff of life. For example, according to Leviticus 11, if a gecko dies and falls on a piece of wood or cloth, it will need to be washed and will be impure until evening. Physical disabilities like blindness or the inability to walk did not make someone impure, but certain skin diseases caused ritual impurity. You can see others on the list on the slide: sexual relations, childbirth, menstruation, irregular discharges. If it was sinful to be unclean, it would be sinful to have sex with your spouse, to menstruate, or to give birth. In other words, this kind of impurity is unavoidable. It's natural, and it normally has to do with major changes in status. This is how Jonathan Klawans describes ritual impurity. The sources of ritual impurity are generally natural and more or less unavoidable. It's not sinful to contract these impurities, and these impurities convey an impermanent contagion. A second misunderstanding about the Old Testament purity system is that it was impracticable. We'd have to conclude then that only the elite could keep the purity laws. The common people couldn't keep the purity laws, or at least they didn't keep the purity laws. They were too busy with their own lives. So Jacob Neusner, as if the masses kept the purity laws. A large part of E.P. Sanders' really important book, Judaism, Practice, and Belief, is to respond to this and to show that the masses did indeed keep the purity laws. And this is his thesis, at least to part of his book. In Palestine, Jews kept most of the biblical purity laws. Next little bit, I want to explain why this is so. And one piece of evidence is that rabbinic literature assumes that the common people did indeed observe many of the purity laws. A second piece of evidence is archaeological. If you go on a tour of Israel today and look at archaeological sites, you'll see many ritual immersion pools, mikvaot they're called. This is an immersion pool at Qumran. You can see the signs of the earthquake there in the stepped pool, and there's the remains of a dividing line to distinguish those who were going down into this ritual immersion pool from those who were going. This is a mikvah in the vicinity of the Temple Mount, and there are many of these found in the archaeological excavations to the south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This, I think, was also taken near the Temple Mount. I've forgotten where I photographed this picture, but it's a covered pool. And you go down into the water, and you should imagine a roof over your head. Here's another one taken in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. And this one, I believe, I photographed at En Gedi, to the south of Qumran. And this is a covered ritual immersion pool in the village at Chorazim in Galilee. Why do we think that the common people did keep the purity laws? One word, mikvaot. The fact that mikvaot have been found in archaeological excavations throughout the land of Israel is powerful evidence that the common people regularly immerse themselves to become ritually pure. You add to that the evidence in rabbinic literature and recognizing that the laws are livable. All ancient religions had purification rituals. Jews differed in detail, not in kind. Amy Jill Levine says this: in actuality, Jews then and now do not find Torah observance any more burdensome than citizens in most countries find their country's laws today. So the idea that the common people didn't keep the purity laws, and that's why they were labeled sinners, rests on a failure of imagination, I would say, not realizing that the law was practicable. On your handout, I have a quotation from E.P. Sanders about the way purification rituals functioned in the Second Temple period. In late Second Temple Jewish Palestine, it was agreed on all hands that women, like men, bathed for purification. In the diaspora, there's less evidence, but Sanders suggests that splashing from a basin seems to have been practiced rather than immersion. A third misunderstanding about the purity laws in Second Temple Judaism is pitting ritual impurity over against an idea of Jesus' holiness. Here's an illustration from a book by Scott McKnight, but the view itself is quite common. Everyone in Judaism knows that impurity is contagious, McKnight says. It spreads to whatever touches it. That is why humans are classified and segregated into the pure and impure. In contrast, purity is not contagious until Jesus comes. The really odd thing about Jesus is that he absorbs the impure blow, transforms it, and then marvelously infects the impure person with his own purity. I'm not concerned here with the idea that Jesus' holiness is contagious. Let me point really quickly to a brand new book by Matthew Thiessen at McMaster University, and it's called Jesus and the Forces of Death. Here's a snippet of his thesis. I haven't actually read the book, don't have my hands on it, but this, I think, is his basic argument. The gospel writers depict Jesus as being divinely equipped to deal with the actual sources of impurity. Once the underlying conditions that create ritual impurity are removed, people are free to follow the simple steps that will remove the lingering ritual impurity. The Jesus of the Gospels is the Holy One of God, a man who embodies a contagious power or force that is opposed to and ultimately destroys the powers that create impurity and death. Notice the difference here. Thiessen is not saying that Jesus' powerful holiness is opposed to ritual impurity. He's suggesting that Jesus is presented in the Gospels as divinely equipped to deal with the thing that is causing impurity, but that the steps to become ritually pure would still be followed by people who are healed by Jesus. So the problem is not the idea of contagious holiness, it's that it's being opposed to ritual impurity. And here too, I would suggest that there's a failure of imagination, of historical imagination. This view doesn't ask how physicians would touch sick people in early Judaism. It doesn't think about how someone would bury their dead. If you have a family member who dies, you're going to touch the corpse and become impure. In ancient Judaism, there was nothing wrong with a physician touching a sick person or a family member touching a corpse, but you would become impure through this touch. So again, this is a variation on misunderstanding number one. It confuses ritual impurity and sin. And that brings us to the model I want to introduce. In his important 2000 book, Impurity and Sin in Ancient Judaism, Jonathan Klawans argues that there are two separate systems of purity in the Bible, ritual and moral impurity. Ritual impurity can be contagious by touch, but it is not sinful to become ritually impure. Moral impurity is caused by sin, but is not contagious, at least not by touching somebody who is morally impure. Sinning does not make you ritually impure. The two systems are different. Moral impurity is caused by major sins, such as sexual immorality or idolatry and murder. It's not, again, physically contagious, but it leads to long-lasting impurity. It defiles the person, the land of Israel, and the temple. The only solution to moral impurity is punishment or atonement. And according to the Old Testament, God sent the Israelites into exile because the land had become defiled because of their moral impurity. The best way to avoid moral impurity is to avoid sin. Ritual impurity, again, has to do with major changes in bodily status that are natural, not sinful. You get rid of ritual impurity by following a purification process, often by ritual immersion in water. Ritual impurity only becomes sinful when someone or something that is impure contacts the sacred. In the Bible, this means the temple or the tabernacle. So there's nothing wrong with ritual impurity. It's contagious. You can make someone impure. Someone can become impure by touching something else that is impure, but it's temporary, and often you immerse yourself in water and wait until evening and you're pure again. In Second Temple times, ritual impurity was extended to include food dedicated to the temple. And my understanding is that if food set apart as tithe becomes impure, you lose that food that you've set apart as tithe. It's not sinful as long as you don't end up tithing it. And so there was a concern to make sure that food set apart as tithe was kept ritually pure. And there's some evidence that ritual purity may have been extended to Torah scrolls, so the scripture texts, and to synagogues. You often find ritual immersion pools in proximity to a synagogue. But it's not entirely clear how this functions. So the idea that you're only sinning if you're impure and you bring something into the temple, that's clear. It's not clear to me from the evidence that I've seen that it would be regarded sinful to enter the synagogue in a state of ritual impurity. But we do see evidence that people outside of Jerusalem, quite some distance from the temple, thought it was good to remain ritually pure, but that didn't mean it was sinful to become impure. Otherwise, it would be sinful to give birth to children or to have sex or to die. Now, it is true that the terms moral and ritual purity do not appear in our ancient sources. You won't find in your Bible a statement that this is dealing with ritual impurity and this other chapter is dealing with moral impurity. Those are modern categories. It's also important to note that some of the same terms are used in the Bible for the two kinds of impurity that Klawans has isolated. Someone who offers their child to Molech makes themselves and the land impure, according to Leviticus 18. Someone who touches a dead animal, someone who touches roadkill, becomes impure, according to Leviticus 11, and the same Hebrew word is used in both cases. The biggest criticism of Klawans' model is that it is too tidy. Isn't it likely that people on the ground would combine the two kinds of impurity and come to think that something to be avoided is also sinful, especially if in the Bible you have the same words that are being used for both categories of impurity? The reason for the two kinds of impurity, for this division between ritual and moral impurity, is that you have different causes, different characteristics, and different solutions for them. They're treated in different ways. So despite overlapping terminology, the differences in how, for example, idolatry and corpse impurity, the differences in how they function show that they are two different systems of impurity. There are also differences in terminology. Sacrificing your child to Molech and other immoral acts are not only called something that makes the land impure, they are abominations. Ritual impurity is never called an abomination. People on the ground might confuse two different kinds of impurity, but we can look at actual evidence to see whether this is the case. And the evidence seems to support Clawans's model. Klawans shows that rabbinic literature distinguishes between ritual and moral impurity in the same way that the Bible does. Sin is not considered ritually defiling, and ritual impurity is not considered sinful. The Second Temple evidence points in a few different directions. So we do see a combination of ritual and moral impurity at Qumran. It seems like they are fused together, at least in the community rule. The Damascus document is not completely certain that the Damascus document has the same concept of ritual and moral impurity combined as in the community rule. Quoting Klawans, sin in the community rule was ritually defiling, and also in some other texts from Qumran. Sin is ritually defiling, ritual defilement is considered sinful, and atonement and purification are closely associated. In Philo of Alexandria, as you might expect, ritual purity is allegorically related to moral purity. Philo doesn't say you should not engage in ritual purification processes. Ritual purity affects the body, moral purity affects the soul, but he takes one as an allegory, an illustration of the other. Language about ritual purity in the New Testament can be used metaphorically in connection with moral purity. So you have Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:17 saying, touch no unclean thing, but he's talking about moral impurity. There's no evidence that in the New Testament that ritual and moral impurity were merged as at Qumran, or that ritual impurity was considered sinful. So when we look at the actual evidence, it does support Klawans' distinction. We've already looked at ritual impurity and moral impurity. There are two other kinds of purity systems that we should talk about that function in the Second Temple period, and they're both encapsulated in this quote by Tacitus. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart. So first, genealogical purity. What this means basically is that intermarriage is prohibited. For Jews in the Second Temple period, it was prohibited to marry Gentiles. The fourth kind of sort of purity system would be the food laws. They overlap with ritual and moral impurity. It's prohibited to eat unclean food such as pork, food with blood in it, mixture of meat and cheese, at least as that came to be understood, the prohibition of cooking a goat in its mother's milk. But violation of the dietary laws is never said to defile the temple, and there's no statement about how one might regain purity. And again, I'm following Klawans closely here. You can see the image on the slide. So Peter has this vision of unclean and clean food on a sheet that's let down from heaven, and the voice comes, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Never, Lord, I have never eaten anything impure or unclean," in Acts chapter 10. This is after spending 3 years with Jesus. Evidently, Jesus never violated the food laws either. Otherwise, you could expect Peter, perhaps along with Jesus, to have eaten something impure or unclean. But he spends all this time with Jesus, and he still holds tightly to the food laws. A little later on in Acts chapter 10, Peter tells Cornelius and the other Gentiles gathered in Cornelius' house, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile." The prohibition against intermarriage and the food laws created a practical barrier between Jews and Gentiles. It enforced social distancing. But some association with Gentiles is presupposed in Jesus' interaction with Gentiles. It's presupposed with the reality of life in the diaspora, where if you are a Jew and you need to get something from the market, you are necessarily going to be interacting with, if not closely associating with, Gentiles. You're going to be touching Gentiles in the marketplace. And it's presupposed with Gentile participation in synagogue worship, where you have God-fearers attending synagogue. And as long as you observe the food laws, actually eating with Gentiles was not impossible, and my understanding is it was not prohibited. It was difficult, but not impossible. So you have Daniel and his friends eating the king's food, not eating the king's food, eating vegetables, but vegetables provided by the king. It's not impossible to keep kosher and eat with Gentiles. And this passage from the Mishnah illustrates that, where it takes for granted in this scenario that there's an Israelite eating with a Gentile, and can you drink their wine or not? So was it lawful, according to the Torah, to associate with Gentiles? Or as Peter says, was it unlawful to associate with or visit a Gentile? Maybe it depends on what unlawful means or on what associating with or visiting means, and we'll come back to this. What I want to say now is that any sort of unlawfulness, however you translate that word, is not because Gentiles were thought to transmit ritual impurity. My understanding of Second Temple Jewish attitudes towards associating with Gentiles relies once again quite heavily on Jonathan Klawans, this time on a 1995 article, Notions of Gentile Impurity. We need to allow up front that the presentation is schematic. The two main points I'm going to make, it's a schematic presentation, and some Jews may have differed. Jews at Qumran are our main example. Jews at Qumran seem to have regarded all Gentiles as a source of ritual impurity. But for most Jews, this is my working assumption, Gentiles were regarded as morally impure. They were people who often engaged in immorality. That's a typical stereotype about Gentiles. They were immoral and they worshipped idols. But moral impurity was not contagious through physical contact. If you're a Jew in the first century and you don't want to be engaged in immorality or idolatry, and you don't want your children to be involved in that sort of thing, you're going to avoid contact with Gentiles. But there's nothing wrong with engaging in business with someone who is immoral, according to the law. Second, the ritual purity system did not apply to Gentiles. Gentiles were not understood to transmit ritual impurity, with the exception of Jews at Qumran. And again, I should say that our evidence is not as complete as we'd like, but this is my working understanding based on the Bible and based on early rabbinic literature. Here's a quote from Klawans. Gentiles are not affected by the ritual purity system. They are exempt from almost all of the biblical purity laws, and nowhere is the Gentile identified as a source or possible conveyor of ritual impurity. Centuries later, the rabbis were quite clear on this point. Gentiles are not susceptible to ritual impurity. One more example. In the temple, there is a court of the Gentiles, and you have to go through the court of the Gentiles to get to the court of the woman and to get to the court of the Israelites. If Gentiles were believed to transmit ritual impurity, then you can imagine Jews immersing themselves in water, becoming ritually pure, going into the temple, and trying to dance their way around any Gentiles who may or may not be there, lest they contract ritual impurity and have to go back and do the process again. That's just one illustration of how impractical it would be if Gentiles in themselves were thought to transmit ritual impurity. So how can Peter say, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile," if the law did not actually prohibit associating with Gentiles? Here's how I understand this verse. The word that's translated unlawful does not actually have the word law in it in Greek. It can be used for things that are unlawful, and this is how it is used in 2 Maccabees. It's unlawful food that the sons who were being tortured were being compelled to eat and were refusing to eat at cost of their lives. So the word translated unlawful is used in that sort of context, but it doesn't have to mean that. It can also have the broader sense of a taboo, something that you just don't do. And that is the meaning that I think fits best in this particular context. So my working conclusion about Acts 10:28 and Peter's encounter with Cornelius is that Peter's problem was with the notion of Gentile moral impurity and with a stiff cultural taboo. And there's a funny contrast in expectations here, because Peter has all of these assumptions about Gentiles, I think, and he's going into a Gentile's house, into a foreign context. And Gentiles actually have assumptions about Jews, and there's a play on prejudices going on in the passage. And when we know the context, Cornelius, of any Gentile, is one who is most likely to serve kosher food to Peter, but Peter doesn't realize that. And I think that play on expectations is what is going on in the passage. To be fair, the biblical purity system is complicated. There is not as much evidence as we would like about how it was practiced in the first century. I am persuaded by Clawanz's model, but there are eminent scholars who take different positions, including ones I've criticized as lacking historical imagination. I don't have it all figured out. We need to assume that there was variety in the Second Temple period. My working approach, though, is to assume, unless there is evidence to the contrary, that the model that I've presented describes the way that most Jews understood the purity system. And I use this as a framework in my reading of the New Testament. So let me go over the quiz questions I put on the board last week. So true or false? Because they were restricted to the court of women, women were considered less holy than men. We'll talk about the temple more in a little bit, but I'll say briefly that holiness and areas of sanctity in the temple, there wasn't a one-to-one correspondence. Just like moral and ritual purity, there could be an analogy between them, but they weren't fused together. So false. You could have women who were respected on all sides as pious, but who were still restricted to the court of women. It was wrong for the woman with an issue of blood to touch a man. Ritual impurity is not a matter of sin. It's not sinful to touch someone who is ritually unclean. Sin does not come into this question. False. The reason common people were considered sinners was because they did not keep the purity laws. False. There's good evidence that the common people kept the purity laws, for one thing, and reading of passages in the Gospels where people are referred to as sinners, it seems like people who are believed to be flagrantly immoral. The law of Moses forbids eating with Gentiles. False. Visiting in the house of a Gentile violated the law. False. Touching a Gentile made a person unclean. False.